The following is an original recording of Ayden Zayn. For more like this, visit aydenzayn.com. That's AYDENZAYN.com.
In Surah 30, Ayah 21 of the Holy Quran, Allah tells us, the English translation of which says, "Of His signs is that He created spouses from among yourselves for you to live with in tranquility. He ordained love and kindness between you. There truly are signs in this for those who reflect." Now let's be honest. We tend to romanticize this ayah. We print it on our wedding invitations, and we talk about it in khutbahs like this, and at Islamic conferences, and we hold it up as this ideal of what a Muslim marriage should be. And it is the ideal. But unfortunately, what we see in reality is that many Muslim couples and many Muslim marriages show something other than tranquility. We observe many of them, not all of them, but we observe many of them bickering, arguing, cutting each other down. They can't wait to get away from each other. And then when they do get away from each other, and you have them off to the side and you're talking with them, they complain, one thing after another about their spouse, constantly complaining. And maybe even they backbite them. And what we find is that many Muslim couples are not happy in their marriage. They feel this kind of unfulfillment. So what can we do about this? And so in this khutbah, inshallah, by Allah's permission, I want to talk about the Muslim marriage. I myself, I've been married, alhamdulillah, for 20 years. I can confidently say that my wife and I are happier today than we were on our wedding day. And this is by the grace of Allah. So I've been blessed in that way, and so I feel like I have these experiences that I can share with you. And the way that me and my wife did it very briefly, we met online, we courted for about 11 months, then we got married, and we went on a nice long honeymoon, about 3 weeks. And then after that, we got back home, and we deliberately decided that we would not have kids right away, that we would take our time, and we ended up spending 5 years in an effort to build that foundation of a solid marriage. And then after that, alhamdulillah, we were blessed to have 4 children. So I pray, inshallah, that what I'm going to tell you, much of it is rooted in Quran and Sunnah, but a lot of it is rooted in my own experience. And of course, I can't cover every topic, but I'll try to give you the most salient points that I hope, inshallah, will help you in your situation. So point number 1 is that we need to understand the whole concept of barakah. This idea of barakah is the blessings of Allah in everything that we do. That if we're not striving to please Allah, our Creator, then we will not have that tranquility and that happiness and that success, not only in marriage, but in anything that we do. And so if we understand this concept of barakah, of blessings, it'll go a very long way for us. And I want to share with you a hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. He mentioned a man who, having journeyed far, is disheveled and dusty, and who spreads out his hands to the sky, saying, "O Lord, O Lord." So praying to Allah, asking Him for something. But his food is haram, his drink is haram, his clothing is haram, and he has been nourished with the haram. How can his supplication be answered? And so the problem is that we don't put Allah at the center of the universe. We don't make Him the most important thing in our life. And many times we make decisions, whether they're important decisions like marriage or smaller decisions. Whenever we're making these decisions, we don't think, how will Allah respond? Is this the right thing to do? Is this according to what He tells me I should do? Is Is this according to Islam? We don't even think of Allah in many cases. And so what happens is in marriage, or before marriage, when we're looking for a spouse, we're breaking all the rules of Allah. We're holding hands. We're speaking in ways with each other that we shouldn't speak, very immodestly, saying things that we shouldn't say to each other, romantically, seductively, whatever. Sometimes we're going even beyond holding hands and we're kissing, or maybe even doing something more than that, if you know what I mean. Sometimes people are even living together with each other. And so again, how do we expect the blessings in that relationship and ultimately in that marriage if we're breaking the rules in the first place? If we're breaking the rules of Allah. And so the barakah will not come. And then, when we finally do decide to get married, we have the Islamic ceremony, we bring the imam, we recite the Quran, we make nice du'as, we have the wedding and they get married, and then what happens just a few minutes later? The party happens. And the dancing between men and women who are not related happens at the wedding, at the walima. Maybe even drinking. Some Muslims, they drink. But yet, just a few minutes earlier, we were reciting verses from the Quran and asking for Allah's blessings. And so there's a disconnect between what we say and what we do, or what we believe. And so if we want the barakah of Allah, we cannot do these things. Now, am I here telling you that we can't have fun? No, I'm not saying that at all. I believe in having fun, but with certain limits. And so in general, we have to have fun within the Islamic guidelines. Simple as that. And if people hearing this are those people who did do these haram things before they got married, if they did date, if they did have relations that were not allowed, if they did have parties at their wedding, the idea is to say, oh Allah, forgive me. Make tawbah and don't lose hope. There's always a chance that Allah will forgive you. You have to have sincerity and make the effort to change your way. And so even if you're getting to know somebody right now, and you're in a haram relationship, you're living with them, try your best to get out of that situation or get married as soon as you can. Number 2, we need to be pragmatic in getting to know one another to some extent before marriage, as much as is Islamically permissible. In the ayah that I already mentioned, Allah says, He created spouses from among yourselves. And what many of the scholars say that means is that your spouse should be like you, should be similar to you, should have similar interests. You should connect in some way, on some higher level. And so therefore, you should get to know each other to some extent. Now, some people may say, well, how can we do that if we can't date? Well, we have to look and see how Islam allows us to get to know each other. The key is to spend quality time with one another. But you cannot do it in privacy. You cannot do it alone. You have to follow certain rules. And so practically speaking, one of the good ways to do that is to meet in public or to meet amongst your families. And the family should not be always right there on top of them, monitoring them, every little thing they do. No. They can be in a separate room, getting to know each other, talking, speaking, sitting with each other. Not touching, of course. But they should have a certain amount of privacy, not seclusion, but privacy in the sense that they can speak openly and freely without the parents hearing them, without the families hearing them. And this is really important because when you get married to somebody, this is how you're going to be with them. You're going to be talking to them. You're going to be speaking with them. You're going to be sitting near them. And there's something that happens between people when they're with each other, a chemical reaction. You secrete certain hormones that tell you, you know what? I don't feel right with this person, or I do feel right with this person. Can I be brutally honest? What if you don't like the way he or she smells? I mean, you may laugh at that, but it's true. This can be the case. I mean, you're planning on living with this person for the rest of your life, right? And so it's important to have that interaction, again, within the Islamic guidelines, not touching, not speaking immodestly, but there is value in being with each other. I'm talking from a very practical standpoint, right? Meet in order to feel the vibe of that person, which you cannot get through text, email, or phone. And then ask yourself the questions. Am I having good conversations with them? Are they making me laugh? Do we have a lot in common? Are there awkward moments of silence? To give you a little bit of my background, when I was looking for a wife, I spent about 5 years searching. And I met with many, many different families and many sisters. And I did exactly this. I sat down and I spoke to some sisters, one-on-one with the family in the other room. Sometimes we would meet at restaurants in public. And sometimes it went well where we had conversations. But other times, the conversation was very, very forced. It was not natural. It was very awkward. And I knew within 20 minutes, this woman cannot be my wife. We can't barely get past 3 or 4 minutes without awkwardness and just not connecting on things. So this is important, to sit down and have these conversations and to have these interactions. And my advice to those people who are looking for a wife or looking for a spouse online, try to meet as soon as possible. Because you cannot have relationships online. Online and internet interaction is good for making a connection. But you have to meet as soon as possible. And before you meet, I would recommend seeing a photo of the person. Because when you hear their voice or you read their words on the screen, you have certain images in your mind of how they should look. Or even they send you an image, they send you a photo, and you say, wow, this looks pretty nice. But a lot of times, and this has happened to me, it's a glamour shot. Or it's a picture from 10 years ago, and she never told you or he never told you. Or maybe you see a picture that you don't like. But then you have to remember that some people are not photogenic. So it goes both ways. And so you have to meet as soon as you possibly can. Because again, marriages are not through phone, or not through internet, or not through email or text. It's in person. You're going to live with that person for the rest of your life, hopefully, inshallah. So meet with them as soon as you can. And because of that, I would recommend not corresponding with somebody who is in a different location than you. Meaning, a far enough distance where you'd have to take an airplane to get there. Because it's just not practical. It doesn't make sense. It should be within driving distance. Be practical when you're getting to know somebody. And then, lastly, with this point, I want to talk a little bit about arranged marriages. Because this is a big issue. And I don't have time to really go into it like I want to in detail. But in general, I don't have a problem with arranged marriages. What I have a problem with is forced marriages. That if we force our son or our daughter into a marriage, that's a big problem. Because of that word forced. If you're forcing them, you're doing it against their will. And so ultimately, they won't be happy. No matter how it looks on the outside, they will not be happy because they're being forced. They're doing something that they don't want to do. And so if you're forcing them to get married, question yourself, why are you doing that? Are you doing that to please another family? Are you doing that to please somebody else? Are you doing that because you're doing it for monetary gain for yourself? Why are you really doing it? So I understand that arranged marriages are part of certain cultures. So I have no problem with that. But the key is, do the ones getting married have a problem with it? That's the important question. And so I would encourage those parents who are thinking about the arranged marriages to at least consult with your son or your daughter beforehand and ask them, are you okay with us arranging the marriage for you? Now, arranged marriages can have many different meanings. That can mean the parents find the spouse and take care of everything from start to finish. And then, the day before the wedding, or even the day of the wedding, you present the bride or you present the groom and say, this is the person you're marrying. In some cases, it works. And I've even met many people who say, I had an arranged marriage. I met my wife or I met my husband the day of our wedding. And we've been married for 50 years happily. So no problem. But I've met other people and I've heard of other cases where that's not the case, that it didn't work out. Really, it depends on the person's personality. Are they okay with it? Simple as that. And if they're not okay with it, have discussions, negotiate, figure out what's best. And another advice to the parents who are more inclined to do arranged marriages, is that recognize that this is not required Islamically, and recognize that this is mainly a practice of your own culture. And that if you come to another country, whether it's England, whether it's Canada, whether it's the United States, wherever, it could be China, Indonesia, if you migrate to another country and you raise your children in that country, guess what? Their culture is not your culture. Their race is your race. But if they grow up in another country and they're around people of that country, they're going to adopt ways of that country. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're going to do un-Islamic things. I'm an American Muslim. I was born in America. I was raised in America. My ways are American, but I'm very conscious of doing things the Islamic way. And so there is a way of practicing Islam within any culture. Islam is universal and can be applied in any culture. So when I say that they're part of that culture, I'm not saying they're adopting un-Islamic ways. They're simply wearing the American dress, whatever is Islamically acceptable. They're eating American foods. They're speaking in an American way. And you have to accept that. Unless you're just sheltering them in the house and never letting them out of the house, which we know is not practical. It's not a reality. So they're going to grow up in these cultures, and they're going to have habits of that culture. And in this culture, the Western culture, arranged marriages are not our culture. So I would emphasize and I would encourage the parents who are thinking about arranged marriages to just discuss it with your children. The key is communication. That is the key. Communicate back and forth. And the children, it's maybe very difficult for them because they don't want to go against the grain. Maybe they have this inclination inside themselves to not go along with the arranged marriages, but they're afraid. They're afraid to rock the boat. I would encourage them, think about the long-term consequences of that. That you're going to end up being stuck, possibly in a marriage, maybe with children, where you're not happy because you didn't get to know that person before marriage. So be very, very careful and approach your parents very delicately, be very respectful, but say, Mom or Dad, I may not be inclined to this way of doing things. Can we possibly do it a different way? So communication is so important. And that leads me to point number 3. And that is that we need to have honest and open communication before marriage. When you're having that time with your potential spouse and you're sitting across the table from them, ask the really important questions. What do you think about having children? There are some people who get married and they never discuss the issue of children. And then they find out later, my husband doesn't want to have kids. My wife doesn't want to have kids. But I want to have kids. This becomes a big problem. And this is after you just had a huge wedding. All the families flying in from all over the world. And you didn't talk about this one very important question? Talk about salah. What's the expectations with salah? Do you pray 5 times a day? Isn't that pretty important? These things need to be talked about forget before marriage, before you guys even go meet your second time. Because I know myself, if my potential wife told me she doesn't pray 5 times a day, that's it, it's done. I myself pray 5 times a day. I don't want to be with somebody who doesn't want to pray 5 times a day. What's the issue with hijab? I see you're wearing hijab now, but do you wear hijab all the time? If that's important to you, make it an issue. Ask about it. Be honest and open. The best time to do it is now, before you advance further, where things become much more complicated to get out of. Talk about money. Talk about travel expectations. Anything that's important to you should not be off limits. And if you feel shy about it, then approach the family. Approach the family when she's not there. And say, I had a question about your daughter. I had a question about your son. Please don't take offense. And then ask your questions. Get the information. This is so important. And if you're embarrassed to do that, have your family meet with their family. Or send an email or a text. Just get the information. Communicate. And you know what I would do? And I thought about this very deeply. I thought for my daughter, inshallah, if she gets to the point where she finds somebody and she wants to get married to them, I thought about an idea. I said, you know what? What I'm going to do, inshallah, at that point, I'm going to take him out to dinner. But I'm going to take him out to dinner at a specific time, just before Maghrib. We're going to make sure that the nice hot dinner is delivered right on our table, right around Maghrib time. Or maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes into Maghrib. And I want to see how he responds. I want to see if he's checking his watch. I want to see if he's acting a little bit nervous. But if he's getting into his meal and I can strike up a conversation with him, and now I'm thinking about it. And I'm like, well, I have to pray. We've only got about 20 minutes left to pray. Is he thinking about it? Now, if he's traveling, different story, because he can combine and delay his prayer. He can pray his salat during Isha time. But if he's not traveling, if I have to initiate it and I have to say, brother, we have about 15 minutes left to pray. We got to go pray. Yeah, you're right. Oh, let's go pray. Come on. That's a problem. That's a big problem. And I'm going to sit my daughter down and I'm going to say, you know what? He might not have his priorities straight. May want to reconsider. And I'll explain to her the situation. And I would hope that she would say, you know what, Daddy? You're right. I want somebody who's going to put prayer first and foremost. And so we should do these things. We should do anything within the Islamically allowable processes to find out who this person really is. And one of the best things that we can do is present a stressful situation to them. Because a lot of people put on a good face when times are easy, when times are good. And so engage that person, not just in a one-on-one conversation, but maybe get the families together and do a project together. Or organize an event. And put a little bit of stress on them and see how they respond. Do they respond impatiently? Do they respond in a way that is not becoming of somebody who says that they follow Islam? Analyze them. Now, of course, everybody loses their temper every now and then. Everybody gets frustrated. That's fine. But is it a habit that they exude? Is it a habit that they show? And how do they treat their own family? How do they treat their parents? Observe them and see. Do you want to marry somebody who backbites their mother or father? Or who treats them harshly or rudely or disrespectfully? If they can do that to their parents, they'll easily do it to you. Number 4, when we get married, we need to recognize that we can't behave the way we did before marriage. Because your responsibilities have changed. So before getting married, think about it. Think about it very practically. How are you going to be now that you're living with another woman? You're living with a man. How is that going to change things for you? Think about it deeply. And I made the mistake, I didn't think about this too much. And what I did was, after our honeymoon, when me and my wife got back home and we settled in, that Saturday, the first Saturday after our honeymoon, I had a home business. I woke up, made my salah, and my wife was expecting me to come back to bed. I went into our home office and I started working, as I normally did as a habit before I was married. I would work whenever I wanted to work. She said, what are you doing? It's a Saturday. I said, yeah, so? I work on Saturdays. No. You're married now. I'm here. Come back to bed. Let's rest. Let's wake up. Let's do other things. Let's do other things that married couples do. So your responsibilities change. Think about this deeply. And think about, can I adjust? And if your wife or your husband says, you know what, it's okay, you can do that, that's fine, good. But negotiate, talk about it, communicate. So the expectations of how things will be after marriage are clearly understood long beforehand. So I gave you a few tips for those who are not married yet. Now I want to talk about a few things that we can hopefully implement in our lives after marriage. So number 5, we need to recognize that difficulties and differences in our marriages is a reality and is something that is normal. You know, we have this idea in our minds before we get married, and sometimes on the honeymoon, we think that this is the way it's going to be for the rest of our life. We're in this kind of blissful state where it's fun and it's happiness and you're traveling or whatever you're doing in your honeymoon phase, and you think this is the way it's going to be. And then you get back home and the reality of life sets in. And it soon dawns on you that, you have differences. You're going to discover differences in your spouse. And I would say, this is my opinion, I would say that this phase the post-honeymoon phase of marriage is the second most important phase in any marriage. The first being that phase where you were getting to know each other. Because that's where the real assessment took place. And that's what led you to be where you are now. But it's this post-honeymoon phase where you're going to discover things that you didn't see before. Because now you're living with the person. You're with them on a day in and day out basis. And so they're going to have idiosyncrasies. They're going to have certain things that they do that frustrate you, that you don't like, whatever it may be. And you're going to have clashes. You're going to have disagreements. I will say this is completely normal. My advice, commit to working through it. Work as a team together. Don't give up at the first signs of difficulty. And a lot of people do this because they have this idea in their mind that marriage is just bliss. It's just happiness. And the first signs of trouble, the first signs of difficulty, that's it, I'm done. I want to get a divorce. No. Work at it. This is something that you're in it for life. You're not going to connect on everything. You may not even connect on a majority of things. But what things are really important to you? And where can you make compromises? Make compromises, make adjustments. And I did this in my own life. My wife did this. We figured it out. We spent 5 years doing this. And guess what? When you do this, as difficult as it is, it's worth it. Because what you're doing is you're building the foundation for your marriage. And if you don't spend time doing this most important step, then guess what? If you're blessed to have kids, those kids, while they are a blessing, they are a tremendous responsibility. And the time and the energy that you have to pour into those kids is going to take away from the time and energy that you put forth into your marriage, into your relationship. And so do it now. As soon as the honeymoon is over, figure it out. Talk, negotiate, compromise. Build that foundation. And the benefits that you will get are priceless. Because if you build that solid foundation, and then you bring children into a solid foundation, that's what you're building your family upon. And if the foundation is weak, the family's going to be weak. Everything could crumble later on. Because kids, when they come, they're going to bring stress. That's just reality. They're going to change your entire schedule. Your sleeping patterns are going to be disrupted. So do that hard work now so that when the difficulty comes, you guys know that you're good. You're solid. And you can show a good example to those kids. And those kids can grow up in a very healthy environment. Now, there are differences. We said that. Question is, how do we work through those differences? And this is point number 6. And I'm going to say it again. We need honest and open communication. So we need communication before marriage, and we need communication after marriage. Now, in conflict resolution, one of the most important points they tell you is that you have to communicate. Don't hold things back. Don't hold things inside. Communicate. Get your grievances out. The biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems in relationships and in marriage, is that we don't convey the honest truth. Now, I'm not saying that you just say whatever's on your mind. You say it diplomatically. You say it tactfully. But you have to get it off your chest. If something is bothering you about your spouse, you should express it. You should talk about it. And then we see so many times, not only in Muslim marriages, but in any marriage or any relationship, we see sometimes physical abuse. We see husbands or wives exploding at their spouse. Sometimes they break things. And sometimes there's physical abuse. Why is that? And I've heard of many situations where marriages are destroyed because of an explosion that takes place of anger from one side or the other, or maybe on both parts. Why does this happen? In my opinion, in many cases, it happens because so much resentment has been building up for so long over small issues. Relatively small issues, but they pile up and they pile up. But we sweep it under the rug. We say, oh, it's okay, I'll let it go. I'll let it go. Until it builds up like a volcano and then it explodes. I want you to listen to this hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. The companions were sitting with the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And he said, coming upon you now is a person of Jannah. And a man walked in, and his beard was disheveled. He was carrying his shoes in his left hand. In other words, he looked like a normal guy. And then, a little time later, maybe another day or two later, they were sitting with the Prophet again, peace be upon him. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, coming amongst you now is a man of paradise. And the same man walked in. Same guy. And this happened another time. 3 times it happened. To the point that Abdullah ibn Amr, may Allah be pleased with him, he went to the man and he said, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said some amazing things about you. Can I stay with you? The man said, sure, of course. So he went and he stayed with the man for 3 nights. And he observed. And he saw the man doing his fard salah, just doing his daily routine. Stayed with him for 3 days. He didn't see anything special. So as he was getting ready to leave, he said to the man, he said, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said that you were a very special man. But I don't see anything special about you. And the man said, I am as you have seen me. And he became very frustrated. Abdullah ibn Amr, may Allah be pleased with him, became very frustrated and he began to leave. And the man stopped him. He said, wait, one thing I forgot to tell you. When I go to sleep at night, I don't have any ill feeling or any jealousy in my heart towards any Muslim. So think about that. Here's somebody who went to sleep at night without any ill feeling in their heart. What about us as husbands and wives? Or friends even. Brothers, sisters, mother, daughter, son, father. We go to sleep and we have these ill feelings in our hearts. My wife, may Allah bless her, she taught me that we will never do this. And this is something new for me. We would have arguments. Yes, we had arguments. We had differences. But anytime we had an argument and we had a conflict, she would not let me sleep. She would say, we are not sleeping until we resolve this. And I can say literally we probably had maybe 30, 40 days or 40 different instances where we had to stay up all night talking or maybe arguing a little bit more until we resolved it. And I thank her for that. Because that is why I think, by Allah's grace, we have such a good relationship today. Because we didn't let these things fester in our hearts. We didn't let them build up and build up and build up until the resentment became so much that we developed a hatred for that person. And this can happen. So my advice is communicate. Talk about it. Get it off your chest. Negotiate. Compromise. Figure it out. Number 7, we need to support one another. In Surah 2, Ayah 187 of the Holy Quran, the translation says, they are a garment for you, and you are a garment for them. Now, yes, this is the English translation, but the most common translation of that ayah is garment. If you think about a garment, it's a piece of cloth. Are you going to put on a clothing that is rough and rugged and it's going to hurt you? No. If it's hot outside, you're going to put on a coat? No. If it's cold, you're going to put on a tank top? No. You're going to put on something that suits you, that makes you feel warm or makes you feel cool, whatever the situation dictates. You're going to put on something that makes you feel good. So our spouses should be a garment for us. In other words, to sum it up, they should be your best friend. They should be somebody that you want to spend time with, that you look forward going home to, that you want to spend the weekend with. How sad is it that we're married to somebody that we don't want to go home to? That's a problem. We need to figure this out. We need to ask ourselves, why is this the case? So I'm hoping, inshallah, that the advice that I'm giving those who are not married will lead you to that point by Allah's permission, or those people who are married, who are facing this. can maybe implement just a little bit of what I'm saying to help reach that goal of having your spouse be your best friend. That's the ideal. That's what we want. They should be a garment for each other. And one of the ways that we can help move towards that point is by supporting one another. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he said, "The best of you are those who are best to their families. And I am the best to my family." And one of the things that really helped me in marriage, to be totally honest, is realizing that there's so many things that we do that we don't realize are an ibadah. They're actually an act of worship. And one of them is servicing your family, is helping your spouse, is helping your children. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he said that when you help somebody up on their horse or on their mount, I mean, they were riding donkeys and camels and horses back then, right? So it was relevant for the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, to say, if you help somebody up on their mount, that's a charity. The spirit of that hadith, or the spirit of that teaching, is if you help somebody. There are many other ahadith where it speaks about services to the community and services to people that are better than prayer, better than fasting. Things like removing a harmful thing from the road. Smiling, even just smiling to somebody, is a charity. And so what the scholars say is that any act of good that you do is an act of worship. And how much more so if that act of good is done to your own family. And so if we have this perspective in our minds, our marriages and our home life will be so much easier. Why? Because like I said, your wife is going to challenge you. Your husband is going to challenge you. You're going to see things you didn't see before. You're going to experience things that you don't like. Have patience with them. You know, when kids come into the picture, my wife, she got sick when she was pregnant. 4 times. She was sick for 4 months each time. And this is a big challenge and a big test for me. You know what got me through it? By the grace of Allah, Allah blessed me with the perspective that every single thing I did for her, I said to myself in my heart, I said, "Oh Allah, accept this as an ibadah." So we have to keep this in our minds and in our hearts, that everything we do for our family, we're getting rewards for it. And this should motivate you further. I mean, we shouldn't need that as a motivation, right? We should do it because they're our wife or they're our husband. They needed our help. But to help us get through it, to deal with the stress, remember, this is like praying. It's like fasting. You are paving the way to paradise for yourself, inshallah. Assuming, of course, that you're doing all the other required things. So try to keep that in mind. And don't blame the other spouse necessarily. You know, when my wife got sick, I could have easily said, "You know, what's wrong with you? Come on, get out of bed. Help me out." I mean, it's something called hormones, right? She couldn't help it. It was just her bodily makeup. And not all women are like this, right? I've heard of women who get pregnant and they're perfectly fine. They can get up, they can go to work, they can take care of the children, whatever. For my wife, that wasn't the case. She had certain health conditions. And so we have to be careful of blaming each other. Try to support one another. Like your best friends. Again, you're there to support one another as a team, as husband and as wife, as garments to one another. Number 8, we need to turn to Allah and seek His blessings and His guidance. Don't forget this. In everything that we do, don't forget about Allah and asking for His guidance. And one of the best du'as that you can make is, "Oh Allah, guide me and guide us to whatever is best for us." And this is an important du'a to make before you get married. It's called the istikhara prayer, right? That you make the salah and you say, "Oh Allah, if this person is best for me in my dunya and in my hereafter, please Allah, make it easy for me and guide me to that. And if that person is not best for me, for my dunya and for my hereafter, then please guide me away from that." Make that prayer and make that in your mind Say, oh Allah, guide me, guide us to whoever is best, because Allah knows what is best. Number 9, never resort to emotional or physical abuse. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he never struck his wives and he never struck a child. And when it came to striking other people, he never did it unless it was on the battlefield in war. Never is it documented in the seerah. Now I understand people get angry. I understand that. And sometimes we do things that we shouldn't do. And so what we have to do is we have to try to control our anger. Because much of the violence and much of the verbal abuse happens when people get angry. Look at what the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said about anger. He said, if you get angry, say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Or, if you get angry, change your position. If you're standing, sit. If you're sitting, lie down. If you're lying down, then stand up and go in a different room. Just get yourself out of the situation. Break that trajectory that you're on of heading towards doing something that you shouldn't do. And then he said, which I think is one of the most important things, is go make wudu. Because when you get angry, what happens? You get hot. And you can literally feel it. You can feel your blood boiling when you get angry. Such wisdom in Islam that he said to go make wudu because water will cool you down. And so what we need to do is we need to try to manage, not stop our anger, but manage it in a way that is suitable and that does not result in any kind of violence or any kind of verbal abuse. And if this does happen, if verbal abuse happens, if emotional abuse or physical abuse happens, then it's a sign that you need counseling. It's a sign that you need maybe even therapy. And there's no shame in that. If you want to do what's best and most productive, go and sit down and talk about it with a professional to address these issues. And then finally, number 10, one of the biggest strains on marriage, and this is a big issue, and I'm not going to get too deep into it because it'll take way too much time, and that is in-laws. In-laws can be a big problem. Not necessarily, but I've heard many, many times that in-laws can cause a big problem in marriage. But I will say this as my one point, that if you take anything away from this khutbah, try to remember this when it comes to in-laws. And that is that obeying parents is no excuse for displeasing your spouse. The wife has rights, and even the husband has rights. And if the in-laws are not getting along with the spouse, you have to consider that maybe you should not be living with your in-laws. Or maybe we need to make a change in how you interact, the interaction between the in-laws and the spouse. And there are many issues that can come out of this, but the key is, again, going back to communication. But there's something deeper than this, something much deeper. And that's these kind of underlying currents that I call them. These currents of anger, which we already talked about. These currents of disrespect and contempt between people. Not only between in-laws and the spouse. I'm not talking about just that, I'm talking about in general. The problem is that we're not really putting Islam into practice. And this is where many of our problems come from. Islam emphasizes so much on having a pure heart. It emphasizes so much on having good character. It emphasizes so much on having healthy relationships. But what do we see in marriages? We see so much disrespect. And I see it so much amongst a father or a mother and their daughter-in-law or their son-in-law. And they say, you're no good for my daughter. You're no good for my son. This disrespect, where is the Islam? And they actually have heard stories of people striving against them, backbiting them to their son or daughter. Can you imagine that? A father or mother saying to their son or daughter, you know, your husband or wife, they're awful people. You should not be married to them. And they backbite them when they're not present talking about them to get their son or daughter to turn against their husband or wife. Where is the Islam? So this is the main problem, is that we're not really practicing Islam. We're not doing what I said in my first point. We're not putting Allah first. We're not putting Allah at the center of the universe. We're putting only ourselves and our own desires, and this needs to stop. So I want to conclude by making a dua from the Quran, which I think is the best dua. Allah knows best. And it's in Surah 25, Ayah 74, where Allah tells us to say, "O Allah, give us spouses and children who will be the joy and the comfort of our eyes and guide us to be models of the righteous." Ameen. Aqimus Salah.